Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. And if you're watching this within a day or two of the video coming out, Merry Christmas. Now, today's video has nothing to do with Christmas. If you want a Christmas-themed video, check out yesterday's on the eggnog riot by the fat electrician. You'll love that story. So in probably the least Christmassy thing ever, this video is titled, Africa's North Korea. And this was suggested to me over on Discord, and it's by the popular channel Hoser. So anytime you bring up something relating to North Korea, it's usually not a great sign for how things are going on. But the history is fascinating, and I'm hoping for opportunities where I can interject that into today's video. All right, the original video is down below. Make sure you're supporting that, please. And let's get started. All right, love it when we start with a map. Do you know where Eritrea is? You know, it's northeastern Africa.
On November 17th, 1869, this small peninsula suddenly became a new global hotspot. Why?
Because
a long ditch was dug through it, allowing ships to sail through this route instead of all the way around Africa.
Suez. That was major. It took. I used to know the times off the top of my head. The British were especially interested in building the Suez Canal because India was their most important colony, and to go around Africa took a couple months, I think. And going through the Suez Canal ended up breaking that up to 2 weeks to revolutionize business.
Overnight, the Red Sea became one of the most strategic regions on Earth to control, or at least have a presence in. One Italian navigation company did just that. They bought the port of Assab from local sultans just 2 days before the grand opening.
So you mentioned Scramble for Africa.
Talk about good timing. And today, well, Assab is just a small city in the much larger country of Eritrea, sometimes called Africa's North Korea. Eritrea is an
I also just saw a video. I don't know who it was by, but it was in my suggestions feed, and it was Albania. I think it was Albania, Europe's North Korea. If I should check that one out, let me know.
Impoverished, highly militarized one-party state. It has been led by a single leader since independence in 1991 and has often been one of the bottom nations in terms of human development. Not only does it have the second highest amount of active military reserves per capita, the country has mandatory conscription for both men and women starting from your last year of high school until whenever you're dismissed. Sometimes when you're 40, sometimes in your 50s.
That's like the ancient Spartans. Like ancient Spartans, you were in active duty until basically you were in your 40s. And yeah, now the context of this, 1869 is during what's called the Scramble for Africa. During the Industrial Revolution, resources and acquisition of resources and workers and all those economic benefits put Africa as a big old target on its back. Because to be honest, at that point in history, Europeans, really the last place left for them to colonize was the internal heart of Africa. And because Europeans, before the Industrial Revolution, did not have success colonizing the internal lands of Africa, they could control maybe the outskirts and ports and stuff like that. It's also why Europeans usually sought to, as part of the slave trade, deal with African leaders themselves to get African slaves rather than do the majority of it on their own. Anyways, Eritrea was one of those places because basically the entire continent except Ethiopia and Liberia, that's kind of a side story, but were colonized and violently as such. And Eritrea, Ethiopia, that part of Africa, they were fighting the Italians. And although Ethiopia was able to defend itself, incredibly, Eritrea was not. So it went through a bunch of different hands because Eritrea, you had the Kingdom of Axum, which was an incredibly interesting, important kingdom you should look at. It was modern day Ethiopia and most of Eritrea. And what made it unique, it was an early conversion, a place that converted to Christianity in like Roman Empire times. And basically was its own little island Christian nation, completely removed from the rest of European Christianity, and was like that for years and years and years. And then also Eritrea, though, specifically, the Muslims, when they started to come through northern Africa, had success there, settling in the very early years in the first century. Not Ethiopia, if you go a little bit further south, but Eritrea for sure. All right, I'm talking too much, but that was the historical context. Italy had colonized Eritrea, and then after after the Italians were kicked out after World War II, the British took it over for a bit. And then Ethiopia, I believe, took it over for a bit and then got its independence, as you saw in the early 90s.
Take
Anyways,
that in.
that's
That's
the bulk of your
basically your
historical
entire
context.
working life as a conscript in the military. Although many of them don't
It's
fight
one of the
because
least
of the unique way Eritrea's government
developed
commands
places in
its
the world.
economy. Conscripts are not just used for war. They are quite literally the backbone of everything in the country. They build the country, run the services, administer it, and of course,
So it's a military government.
Eritrea. All for very little pay, suffering abuse and harsh conditions in what is essentially a mass system of forced labor.
By the way, if you saw that list earlier, they said of most militarized nations, most of them are ones, except the United States, which has the largest, but are places that have mandatory military conscription, often with terms of like 2 years. But as you're seeing with Eritrea, it's much longer. So that's why they have such a big. And I didn't know they were that high, but that makes sense why they're the most militarized states possible, because basically every able-bodied person is technically active
No
military.
surprise then that Eritrea is also called the world's fastest emptying country because of how many citizens run away from it.
There's no economic
Around
development.
800,000 by 2023. That's in comparison to a home population of only 3.7 million, meaning almost 1/5 of all people born in this land have left it.
Jeez. So I'd have to look at more about why the development again is so slow. I mean, a lot of it, I mean, if you're independent in the 90s, so be it. But I mean, as compared to the rest of the decolonization process of Africa, because any place that is going to be, brutally colonized when it gets its independence is going to have a very, very hard time getting back on its feet, because colonization is all about extracting those places of their wealth, of their resources, without building permanent infrastructure for them to sustain themselves. That wasn't the point of colonization. So it left a lot of places, destitute. And some places in Africa are going to bounce back. But you can see with them, they went from, being colonized by the Italians brutally, and then they, Somalia, and they get caught. Somalia has all kinds of issues, as it was a kind of a hot spot for the Cold War as well, and like bouncing back and forth. Or Ethiopia. So I say Somalia earlier, I meant Ethiopia, but kind of getting caught in the Cold War things too. So basically, the more colonized a place was, the harder it's going to be successfully independent, especially if you're not naturally resource rich, which Eritrea is not, except for its strategic location along the Red Sea, which is also where the majority of now where oil comes in and out of.
But
anyway, I'm
is
talking way too
Eritrea
much. We're 2 minutes in.
like North Korea,
All right, shut up,
that
Mr. T.
crazy hermit kingdom? I don't know. There are some key differences. For one, nukes.
One's in
Eritrea
Asia.
does not have a nuclear weapons program, and
They don't have a
thus
nuclear
is
ally,
much less of a
like North
threat than
Korea
North
did with
Korea
Russia
is.
and China.
They don't have the capability to straight up destroy their neighbors if the military just feels like
Gotta
it
have an
one day.
ally that has it.
If you were to leave
Take that,
Eritrea,
Djibouti.
you could come back one day, although with some difficulties. Whereas if you leave North Korea, you're dead to them. Eritreans
Literally.
have a lot more exposure to the outside world through TV and the internet, although the majority still don't have access to them yet, and both are still heavily monitored and regulated by the government. And
I did not know that. I wonder what they use to monitor their government or their internet access. North Korea has to go through a ton of software, development or anything that to completely protect their computers. And it must be crazy what like China has too, with how big of a country that is and technologically developed they are, but have such controlled internet.
lastly, Eritrean loyalty is meant to be to the nationalistic, triumphant Eritrean state and military, not to the
working well?
family that runs it. Still, there are plenty
Yeah,
of
they're a
similarities.
theocracy.
We'll run through 4 that I think give you a good picture on the
reason,
hows
power,
and the
command,
whys of
isolation.
Africa's North Korea.
Great.
First, militarism.
we got?
Look at this fun parade.
There's women.
All the soldiers marching as one. What do you think they might do? Invade Ethiopia? Maybe even Djibouti?
Yeah, what is their
I'm
militarization
not
and
sure,
response
but
of? Is there militarization and response of like maybe Ethiopia wants to come back? Do they think the Italians are going to come back? I mean, the Italians had to come back twice because they weren't so good after, in the scramble for Africa for that whole region back before it was Eritrea, Somalia. And then Italians came back with Mussolini. And that was I know that was a brutal
I can
time
say
for
that
Eritrea.
Eritrea was a country made by war. even back in the Italian times. Originally, the Italians did not try to grow this dry and rocky colony that much. They wanted control over the fertile interior mountains in East Africa, but were defeated by Ethiopian armies in the 1890s.
Battle of Adwa.
The land they
think about that. Look into the Battle of Adwa. Think it basically is the only real successful African military resistance, and it's astounding what they were doing. I think that was King Menelik, right, who kind of saw a lot of this stuff, this incursion coming, and had kind of developed the military to be kind of ready for it. And that was a big embarrassing thing for the Italians. Why Mussolini ended up coming back for Ethiopia.
Did keep in Eritrea wasn't all that interesting to them, despite the prime seaside location. Interest came back with a change in government, though. The new fascist Italy was obsessed with trying to reconquer Ethiopia. And where was their starting block to invade? Right here in Eritrea.
They did have
Suddenly,
success there.
investment, infantry, and Italians flooded in. The new Italians brought workers to build up urban infrastructure and industry. And that's why Asmara still looks so Italian today, and heavily subsidized the colony, bringing in the foreign goods
the British
and food
pound
they needed. But the, let's say, more conservative-minded fascist Italians also brought new laws with them. Yeah. The new towns they built were built to be segregated. They limited Eritrean education to only up to the 4th grade, confiscated Eritrean cash crop farms, and conscripted.
This is just par for the course for African
to help
colonization.
the fight against Ethiopia.
It's never to help
this
the locals.
Obviously didn't go over too well with the people, and it created an identity through a shared economy.
Did they develop Fiat's Italian, right? Fiat Italian car. Did they do like manufacturing there?
Obviously didn't go over too well with the people, and it created an identity through a shared enemy. Otherwise, this linguistically, religiously, ethnically, and geographically diverse nation probably never would have come
probably a little bit Christian influence.
The newly trained Eritrean soldiers never rebelled against the Italians, though, because the colony was taken over by the British in World War II.
After World War II. Brits, I mean, the Allies took over everything, all the excess colonies, just like they did in World War One. And then it's just about, what do you do with them after? Did you promise it to people, or the British going to leave it a mess like they did with Palestine, after the war?
Were really interested in administering Eritrea, especially when their empire was in the middle of collapsing.
Yeah, they could.
The most they really did was
decolonization,
strip Italian-made assets and deport many of the fascist administrators who ran the colony. Many Italians left the colony in this period, so in the end, the UK and UN came to an agreement in 1952 to just make Eritrea an autonomous region of neighboring Ethiopia. Funny they did that.
But I want to know, they made it part of Ethiopia. I'm interested. Hopefully he chimes in here with what the Eritreans thought of that. Did they just think, well, Ethiopia was going to be a place after World War II that was going to be a strategic place that's going to be competed for in the Cold War. Ethiopia, Somalia, and they had some very interesting interactions, a lot of pressure from the U.S. and Soviet Union to become allies with them, because both were getting independence. And usually what you saw after World War II in a lot of these African countries that have no infrastructure to build their new country was they sought the aid of foreign nations who could give you the best deal. And after World War II, I mean, really, it's just the British can't help you. They have no money left and stuff like that. It's the United States and Soviet Union. And then they're like, oh, gosh, I don't want to ally with either of those. And it's hard to be part of the non-aligned movement, but these countries around here in Eastern Africa, it was quite an interesting experience where they would kind of test the waters of both sides.
Funnier when they were slowly annexed by the Ethiopian Empire, officially voting Eritrea out of existence in 1962. Eritreans became second-class citizens.
Was there a sense of Eritrean nationality
were harassed or killed, and political parties, the press, and unions were crushed under Ethiopian rule. So if you thought the rebellious military culture was made under fascist Italy, you were wrong. A 30-year war followed this. 30 years, yes, 3 decades. The final straw being the fact that they would no longer teach the majority language Tigrinya in school, instead opting for Amharic, the language of the Ethiopian government. Resistance started off as a Muslim movement, but then spread to workers and spread even further to a general nationalist movement.
Still that Christian flavor kind of there in that part of Africa too. And you go west too, and Sudan had a similar problem where you had these African Christians and then African Muslims, which provided division and a lot of violence in those cases.
Eventually, this movement split up, with the most successful successor being the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. Fighting lasted through the Cold War with all of its shenanigans. It was
Yep, US Soviet
decades
Union.
of fighting, massacres,
Proxy war.
razings, mass burning,
Proxy war.
sometimes even between Eritreans. And as time went on, the Eritreans continued fighting in a way that the Ethiopians were getting tired of.
Yeah,
Fighting
let it
alongside
go,
the Tigray PLF, funds and equipment dropping off at the end of the Cold War, and battles won in the mountains led to Eritrean victory and a declaration of independence in 1991.
Also important probably to understand that you're not going to have any more support from Soviet Union or anything like that, because the Soviet Union is now abolished in 91.
And now,
but I mean, they were fighting on their own by that
everyone's
time.
happy and peaceful. The revolutionary fighters could now focus on governing their newly made country. The EPLF became
where did it
PFDJ, the
go
People's Front for
wrong?
Democracy and Justice. What a that would be. So did the fighting stop after independence? No. This is when they made their mandatory conscription,
now Civil
although
War?
for the time it was only 18 months long and didn't control their entire society.
Not too bad.
Most new government officials were commanders and officers in the fight for independence. They knew how to run an army, but not a country. After independence, Eritrea was involved
Very
in
different.
a small world.
That's why historically you don't find that many absolute monarchs, in history. Absolute monarch being somebody that heads all branches of administration, because sometimes a leader is good at the cultural stuff or maybe the military stuff, but they're bad at like economic stuff. You know what I mean? So they assign ministers and stuff like that. So it's a different skill set completely of running a military versus running a country.
Yemen, the First Congo War, the Second Sudanese Civil War, a war in Djibouti, got sanctioned after that one, and a real doozy in Ethiopia from 1998 to 2000. You see, the TPLF eventually installed a government in Ethiopia, and even though they fought with the Eritreans for independence, the two movements did not get along. The government has always had this idea that the TPLF is trying to destabilize Eritrea and remove them from power. So relations between the countries soured throughout the 90s, the two countries stopped trading, had border skirmishes, and an outright war broke out in 1998 over the tiny village of Badme. Although it only lasted for 2 years, conflict between them was on and off for two decades until a formal peace treaty was signed with the new Ethiopian government in 2018. Hope! Not for long, though.
What's going on in the last 5
2020,
years?
they joined the Ethiopia-Tigray Civil War, fighting once again with their compatriots. Just kidding. They were fighting with Ethiopia against the TPLF again.
Oh my gosh.
They blocked food shipments from the sea, pillaged villages, murdered citizens, and even did this to their own Eritrean refugee camps, all in an effort to officially crush the TPLF. So if you were to add up all the wars, all the people affected, moved, or killed by constant warfare in this tiny country, it would be a lot of people. Eritrea was made by war. Second is power.
I mean, that right away then explains stuff. I mean, country that's more likely to have warfare is going to have a government system that prioritizes the military because it's the most important priority. But how can you do that while trying to keep up a functioning nation, especially when you didn't have much to start with?
I should tell you more about the government. In general,
Camels.
I guess you could
Is there
call
a
them
camel?
paranoid, isolationist, and brutal with their punishments. Particularly, this guy is Isaias Afwerki. He's been at least as long as I can remember, as long as anyone can remember. That's because if we're going off the perspective of the Eritrean nation, he's been president forever for 100% of the independent history.
Like 30 years.
Don't rule a country since 1991 without having some typical dictatorial characteristics.
True. Because eventually you feel invincible if you have that long. If you're not really worried about term limits and all that stuff, you can have small changes or no changes or something like that because you don't feel you have a threat. You don't have to like appeal to the voters. The only thing you would have to fear is like an uprising. But if you completely control the country, which is militarized, you really don't have much of a threat, do you? Unless it comes from the military. That's what often happens in military dictatorships. The only way that they fall is through uprisings within the military.
Through military commander who became president. He spearheaded the war efforts, was paranoid about foreign powers, arrested opposition leaders, and arrested many of his own citizens for arbitrary and unknown reasons. One of the most common ways to do this was to detain dozens dozens of people at a time inside of these shipping containers. Better pray it doesn't get too hot outside.
Which it does.
Damn,
105
these
average.
metal prisons get hot. We're talking potentially up to the 60s or 70s degrees Celsius. And this
Americans 40 is like 120, I think, right? Around there. That's death. You die at that.
barely scratches the surface of all the torture and abuse the soldiers face. Maybe Isaias isn't a great dude. So if there was any point where all hope of a regional development plan was lost, it was definitely 1998, the militarization of society. The ongoing war with Ethiopia was an excuse to extend conscription from 18 months to, well, they just say indefinitely, but it's usually around 25 to 30 years of service, aka your whole working career in forced labor. Slowly, the government eroded the powers of society and the people. Elections in 1997 were postponed to 2001 due to the war, and then postponed again because part of the country was occupied at the time. I guess we're still waiting for this one to happen because there have been no elections since independence, even in local elections.
By the way, they're talking about this in Ukraine right now with so much occupation of eastern Ukraine and the millions of people outside of, or that have now fled Ukraine, about what to do about elections in Ukraine. Think about it. It's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, because if you want to push elections, well, what do you do for the people that are seeking exile, that left Kharkiv and these other cities? Like, it's not going to be possible or very, to be able to get all those votes in. But at the same time, if you push or if you abandon the election, then it looks undemocratic, right? And it's like, yeah, undemocratic, and maybe people would want new leadership in to deal with this. It's like I said, damned if you do, damned if you don't situation in Ukraine, when you are actually occupied. So you can see what's going on with Eritrea, but looks like even when things settle down, they weren't going back to normalcy.
The last ones took place in 2003. The PFDJ doesn't even trust small town mayors. Newspapers were shut down in 2001, and yes, journalists have of course been high on the list of citizens arrested and detained for challenging Isaias.
Once your press is censored and you're like getting rid of journalists, it's over. Like it's over for you as a country.
Entrepreneurs and business owners, those that ran shops that weren't PFDJ owned and operated. Yup, into the shipping containers they went. There have even been reports of soldiers going door to door under the pretext of data collection or asking how service is going for the family, but it's really to identify draft dodgers and those who fled the country. And to flee the country, you have to get through heavily guarded borders, either through bribery or gunfire, or just see where the ocean takes you.
It's illegal to
many times if they catch you doing this, they'll get a family member to replace you in conscription or
that's North Korean style. North Korea does family punishments. They're known for like military defectors or political dissenters. The thing they're said to do is to take the family members of them and put them in those forced labor camps
as punishment,
as a deterrent to.
Personally, to me, Isaias doesn't really seem like a stable guy. I might even go as far to say that he and the PFDJ have ruined the nation. But hey, not everything is politics. There's always the economy, right? So third, command. How is that economy? Well, it's a little different to how it works in the US or Europe or India or even China, which claims to be what Eritrea actually is, and that's a command economy.
Okay, China's not a command economy. Well, no, because there's a lot of privatization with that. I mean, everything in the end has to do things with approval, I guess, of the government. But usually when I think of command economy, I think of Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin put every aspect of the Soviet economy onto the Communist Party. So the government ran all those, which is completely anti-communist, right? It's supposed to be in the hands of the workers and the people, but it was taken away and, run by the government so they could, do the 5-year plans, which it did boost their economy at, an incredible cost, I guess you would say, but anyway,
China, which claims to be what
United States is not a command
actually
economy.
Is, and that's a command economy. Almost everything, at least in the cities, is run by the PFDJ and the conscripts working for them. I say in the cities because more accurately, it's a dual economy, one based on government command and the other on subsistence farming. So this GDP per capita number might not be too accurate when talking about the Eritreans. In cities like
subsistence farming, that just means you farm. I mean, you basically just farm for yourself. It's not cash crops. So, but are subsistence farmers also working as well for government projects?
Ara, Karen, and Assab, the PFDJ rules all. I mean all. Private business is outlawed in the nation.
Okay.
Instead, many farms,
No private
businesses,
ownership.
administration, and services are run by, yes, you guessed it, the conscripts. For example, all private construction
Run by them, but do the workers have control over that? If they want to be, say they're like a socialist state, then the workers should have the ability to, it's democratization of the workplace. That sounds like it's not there. So it does sound very command economy-ish
companies
now.
were banned in 2006, and the government even went so far to demolish already built homes because they were financed from foreign money by a private firm. So infrastructure is weak.
But there's no money to start
Only a
with
fifth of
except
the
for
country's roads are
foreign
paved.
money.
Industry hasn't made people richer. Property rights are borderline non-existent. But hey, at least forcing people to learn how to read does actually improve the literacy rate.
Yay.
So that's one good
Their
thing they've
literacy to
done.
do what, though?
The PFDJ and military
Not control their
essentially have a
economic
monopoly
future.
on all trade, construction, markets, mining, and cash crops in Eritrea.
They do have
in
cash
fact,
crops.
most of the trade leaving is from government,
But they're owned by
mines
the
selling
government.
to China and the Emirates. Most of the stuff coming into Eritrea is a little more essential to life, especially this category, food. Although the country claims to be self-reliant in food production, often rejecting aid, their imports clearly suggest otherwise. Forcing people to run farms they don't want to is one way to curb food production, but it might not be entirely their fault. Eritrea is a dry country with a very
Yeah, I was
little
wondering how
amount of
agriculture
arable
was even
land.
very good.
Most of the food going out of the nation is a small amount of cash crops like bananas and peppers, but most of the
fruits?
food coming in are staple foods eaten every day. When
I mean,
you
that makes
live
sense. I mean, even like other countries, had to do, like the ancient Greeks did that. I mean, they, not a lot of arable farmland in Greece. So trade your mining materials, your grapes, I guess. And then, you sell it to Egypt, who's, going to give you grain.
most of the food production seems to be for small-scale domestic eating, almost on a subsistence level, which is where most people work. Most Eritreans do not live in urban centers. They live on small farms or pastoral land. Small villages
That means they have no factories. Factories require urbanization. So there's, no factories. It's just
on
agriculture.
family units instead of the PFDJ for welfare. Of course, when drought and soil erosion hits, these are the people most affected by food and water shortages. But they're also often the ones least affected by the business bans, setting up what are called micro businesses in small towns in the cities. Basically just market stands of their crop, making ends meet in the cash-based informal economy.
I want to know what they declare their economy as. Like, are they saying this is like a socialist state of some kind where the workers are supposed to own and operate the means of production? Do they actually because that's gonna, even though a lot of places will declare that, right? That doesn't actually can happen, especially when you have that much government intervention. But I wonder what they declare themselves, or like if you'd ask the people, what kind of economy are you? They'd just be like, oh, gross stuff.
So besides the market vendors working for cash, what do the conscripts work for? I'll let General Sabat Ephraim, Minister of Defense and Mining, explain it for me. Even though each of the conscripts has between 2 and 3 children, they only receive 500 nafka per month.
$33.
How do they do it? The reward is not a salary because the amount
What is
they
it then?
receive is
What services are they getting?
insignificant. Instead, patriotism
Oh my
is the
God.
driving force.
It's literally okay. I know it's feudalism. It's literally feudalism, except the lords are the military government. They're working for the daimyo. It's basically like Japan, working for a military warlord. And yeah, then you get your protection because you get your small little subsistence farming land, and then a home or something like that. They're feudal. That's actually what they are. Militaristic feudal. I don't know. I mean, feudalism's always militaristic, but I don't know, whatever you call it.
Private firm were to take over, it would be solely driven by pecuniary interest rather than by patriotism. In the beginning, the conscript will be happy to receive 100 nafka, but soon after, he will demand more.
Oh, no.
In the end, money will dictate everything.
no.
Nothing can be accomplished.
They are trying to go communist, but they're lacking the checklist, right? To be communist, you have to be moneyless, stateless, and classless in society. They basically got the state. They basically got actually they have 2 of them. They have classless and they have moneyless, but they don't have stateless. Sorry, you're gonna have to drop the state, and then the people can actually recoup their the fruits of their labor. But it doesn't look like that is what's going to happen there. And it is interesting because that's kind of in a lot of ways how North Korea is.
Patriotism will drive the country, all while the ones who own the mines and businesses make a fortune off of free labor and won't reinvest the profits.
Nobody gives a
back
crap
into
about patriotism if you can't put food on the table.
Patriotism will drive the people to work for only $30 a month. But it also seems to drive them out of the country in mass numbers, which has led
Where do they
Eritrea to 4. Isolation. A lot of Eritreans live outside of their closed borders.
Huge diaspora.
One thing that means is that a lot of
Canada.
Eritreans send money back home to their families, called remittances. Despite the whole self-reliance thing, it's estimated that around 20 to 40% of the GDP comes from these remittances. In a country with a large level of poverty, little to no pay, low foreign reserves, and food insecurity, remittances are a way for many to keep their heads above water, maybe even to build up some savings to,
The government in total denial of this, though.
The government does try to restrict them, though. A family can only withdraw up to 5,000 NAFKA in cash every month.
You'd think they wouldn't, even for all the crap that they display about their people not caring about money. It's like, you want that money in your economy. You want them to spend that, right?
Around $330. That's not a whole lot to subsist with, so some argue remittances have not helped to develop Eritrea. They've just stabilized an unstable economy built off of
Kept them
forced
from
labor. Pretty ironic for a country so insistent on its
Genocide,
self-reliance from the outside world. Another irony, the diaspora tax. Every Eritrean refugee is supposed to pay 2% of the money they make outside of the country
they're not
back
doing
to the
that.
Eritrean government. It's one of only a
they actually
few
doing it?
countries on earth to tax their citizens living outside.
How can
of
they
the
even do
nation.
that?
I'm looking at you, America. Considering how many refugees there are,
no one's
that's
gonna
got to
pay
be a
that.
pretty big
How can they
portion of the
enforce it?
government's revenue, right? Maybe. The government does not share their income or budget. The Hidri Trust Fund
probably
controls
embarrassing.
all state enterprises, although no external monitoring is allowed of it. So not even the Ministry of Finance knows where the money goes. Still, we could assume this tax makes up a pretty big chunk of the budget. PFDJ-run businesses don't pay tax, and neither do the hard-to-reach rural populations.
It's like they want to be like a socialist or communist state, but without any of the things that people like about it.
But 60% of outside Eritreans report at least sometimes paying the 2% tax, and almost all said they send remittances to their families.
Bull crap.
Small-scale family financing likely has a bigger impact than the government's tax collection and payments.
Yeah, I mean,
it's
that's
a
probably
confusing
true, yeah.
system. I can't tell you everything about the economy, but I think this quote from a fled minister sums it up pretty well.
Ooh, a fled
In the
minister.
beginning, I thought the diaspora tax was justified, but over the past 20
But
years...
how? Okay, I want to know though. What is their vehicle, or what's their way to tax people that aren't even in their country? Like tax the remittances. So when the money comes through, like back to the country, are they able to like get that? I don't know how they send money. Is it, I mean, shared internet accounts or like Western Union or something like that? Do they tax the remittances? That seems like the only way you could possibly tax a diaspora.
Been a visible thing done in Eritrea. We don't know where the money goes.
gosh.
When I worked at the Ministry of Finance, I was involved in diaspora tax issues.
Yeah.
The Ministry of Finance has no control over the spending of the money. It also does not control the mining income. In the end, it is the president's office and the head of PFDJ's financial affairs
probably going
that
to the
control
military, right?
everything. The PFDJ has
Must
a
be
lot of
expensive.
companies. They don't pay tax. They are
Right.
like the private property of the ruling elite.
Yeah.
Does it raise questions that most of the info we get about these systems are from those who clearly didn't like the country enough to run away? Sure. I'm sure there are some that exaggerate how bad Eritrea is to get more
Sure, some
attention than trying to be
Eritreans,
totally honest. But doesn't it raise more questions when there is barely any information coming out of the country in the first place?
They
Maybe it's just
didn't they say they outlaw, or they state controlled the newspapers, or they don't have newspapers and they jailed the journalists.
me,
It's
but
always
I
the red
think
flag.
I'm more inclined to believe the refugees' stories of
I'm on the case. I'm going, guys. After this video, I'm going to Eritrea. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. Okay, if I don't come back, figure out what to do with the channel.
Power, command, power held by a few, and self-reliance. That's what makes people call Eritrea Africa's North Korea. Shout out to Yao for inspiring
Good
this
video.
video. If you like to read about economics, he writes a pretty good newsletter with a particular focus
Nice.
on African economies.
Ooh.
Check him out if you're interested.
Fascinating.
I mean, you're already done.
The projections for the African economies are going up, and when you start looking at 50 to 100-year projections, Africa's going to be a very different place. Anyway, final thoughts. All right, fascinating video. I knew little or nothing about the current geopolitical state of Eritrea. I did not know they had this like military dictatorship command economy thing going on. I knew about their history, but up until independence, I knew little to nothing. So I think we need to be checking back in on our independent African countries to see how they've done. Just because a country gains its independence does not mean things are going well, right? So we better check in on all our friends across the world post World War II decolonization. All right, great video there from Hosier. Asked a few questions to you guys down below. Hope to see some comments from you. Thanks to those that suggested this video. Best place to do that is to come over to the Discord server. There's a video suggestions channel. That's where my eyes are the most when it comes to suggestions. All right, with that, I'll see you all next time. Bye.